One way our culture has changed is the growing openness to new beliefs and behaviors related to sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender. Because we minister and parent on this changing landscape, we find ourselves engaged in all kinds of conversations with young people who express different beliefs and practices. As Christians work to be faithful to the Scriptures, we will encounter a variety of interpretations of the passages dealing with sex, sexuality, and gender. How are we to look at and interpret these passages? What should we believe regarding God's order and design? And what posture should we assume as we engage with those from the LGBTQ community? We'll be chatting with author and theologian Preston Sprinkle about these questions and more on this episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
I'm Walt Mueller, and this is Youth Culture Matters, and Jason Soshanik is with us. And Jason, you look incredibly excited. You're wearing, as always.
I'm always excited.
You're always. You're wearing.
Well, not always. Sometimes.
I can see you. Nobody else can. What are you wearing on your head?
Well, I'm wearing a Cubs hat, but you make it sound like I wear one every podcast, and that's just not true.
You do, basically.
I do have. Well, I have a love for the Cubs, and what most people don't understand is we're recording early in the morning on the West Coast, and you're on the East Coast, and it's a little later in the morning.
Oh,
and I typically
hat head or bad hair. You haven't been able to curate your hair.
Yeah.
Your coif, is
I've
that what we call it, a
and-
coif? You do spend a lot of time tending to your hair. I know that you curate your hair really well.
You like to think that, but I don't. But that's okay.
All right.
That's okay.
Okay.
I appreciate the love and affection towards
Love and
the
affection.
curation of my
It's
hair.
observation. That's all it is observation. But hey, but I'm saying the Cubs hat. All right, baseball season.
Yes, talk to me.
We're
Baseball,
going. Okay,
baseball's
who's
upon
gonna?
us.
What your predictions on who's gonna win the World Series this year? Let's do it right at the beginning. Let's come out and say who we think.
I think the Cubs are going to win the World Series again
Another guess?
this year.
I love
wow,
this
I didn't
buzzer.
even know
It's
you had
great,
that.
man.
Yeah, I bet you do. Well, let me hear yours.
What do you think, Chris?
He's going to say the Yankees.
Yeah, I don't get into the predictions of who's going to win.
Oh, come on. You're a Yankees fan. What do you think?
I hope the Yankees
Oh,
win
wait,
the World
Okay,
so-
right. So it's a hope.
But
yeah.
it's never a prediction
Okay.
or a guarantee or
Yeah,
anything
yeah,
like that
yeah.
coming from me.
Yeah.
It's always a hope.
Walt?
Well, if it's not, Jason,
Who do you
you
have?
tell me. If it's not the Cubs, who do you think it'll be?
If it's not the Cubs?
Yeah, if it's not the Cubs.
Well, I think. Oh man, I think it potentially is going to be either a Red Sox Cubs series or it's going to be an Astros Cubs series. Okay, so who do you think?
Well, you're supposed to say it.
No, I'm not supposed
I'm
to say
such
it.
a homer.
You say
Go
it.
on, just to say it. Let me use my my little thing here that says yes, you got it right. I don't know. Well, we got one of your
You think
pitchers.
the Phillies are going to make it? You think the Phillies?
Isn't it every year of my life?
I like how you answered that with a
I
question,
am
Jason.
such a homer.
It wasn't
and
a
that's,
statement. It was a question.
That's the way we're supposed to be as fans, right? Your home team,
Oh,
you
well,
just
no,
live and
that's
die
not
with
true.
them. It's every
Then
year.
This just goes to a whole nother level because I've always been realistic about my Cubs. Every year I've said we might make the playoffs, but we're not going to win the World Series. Or I might say well, we're going to be horrible this year.
Yeah.
I've learned to be realistic in my years.
Yeah.
I've been a Cubs fan my entire life.
Walt's type
And
of fandom
for
is
many of those
what
years,
pushes over into the obnoxious scale.
Oh, come on. Just because I hope I sit.
No, that's what
And
I said.
I
I
hope
said
I said-
hope.
Yeah.
You're laying out predictions and guarantees.
But this is what you're
It's
supposed to do
April's
as a
all
fan at
about
the
hope.
beginning of the season, right? So, the season starts.
okay, so tell
and
me
you
why
have your
you
first
think
day,
I
your
can give
team
you
wins,
many reasons.
and you're going, oh, man, we're in first place. The second day of the season, we're in first place. We're on our way. that's just what. And you
Okay.
got to understand. I
Give me two
started this
reasons
as
why
a little
Phillies-
kid.
Tell me 2 reasons why you think the Phillies will win the World Series this year.
Well,
just
I'm
a
not
fan,
going to say. I'm
2
saying
reasons.
I hope. I'm not. I mean, in my childish.
Please tell me one of them
my
is a former
childlike
Cub named Jake
hope.
Arrieta.
Well, yeah, that was a good move. Okay, so I agree with that. But the other is,
Yeah.
Think about our city right now. There's so much joy in the city over the Eagles winning that everything's. I don't believe in this, but everything's starting to line up. It's like it's all starting to line up. So you've got to go.
So now So even the Sixers are going to get on this action here
Well,
soon.
I don't know. I'm not saying anything about any other teams, so we'll get there. But it's
Okay.
It's always fun. I mean, you got to be. That's the joy of being a fan. These guys who they root
Sure.
for 4 or 5 sports, and every team is in a different city. That doesn't work for me. You're not.
Oh, hey, I'm in a similar spot. Bears, Cubs. But here's what I'll say. The Cubs. Here's why I legitimately think that they're going to do another World Series. If they've figured out their leadoff hitter, they're going to be an incredible team this year because their lineup, their rotation is incredible. Their lineup with batters, I mean, they've got so many different options. And so if they get the leadoff hitter situation figured out, we're going to be unstoppable. I mean, it's going to be, and we don't have a hangover from the World Series the year before. It's really difficult. That's why I don't think the Astros will probably go. I think that people underestimate the hangover from the year before winning the World Series. It's big. It's why the Giants went every other year for a few years.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
So,
we'll revisit this.
We'll see. We have this now recorded. Yeah. So what will be fun is in October to see which one of us was right.
I was gonna ask you for your soccer predictions, but sorry, we don't have time.
Well,
we're not gonna. No,
you can ask for my soccer predictions in the World Cup, and it's pretty
time.
easy because the USA team isn't in it. So
yeah, well, that only leaves 300 other countries or something like that are going to try to make their way in there. I don't know how much everybody. Yeah, 32. I don't know. I just don't know. 32. Chris, would you know how many teams make it to the World Cup?
I would not have known the answer. No.
Yeah. I mean,
I would also not have cared about the answer.
Yeah, I figured as much. Well, here we go on soccer again. Well, Jason, let's shift gears here. We got to move on from baseball to talk about something more serious. And today we're going to have Preston Sprinkle join us to talk about sexuality and matters related to LGBTQ. He's been thinking about these a lot and rather prolific in terms of a thinker and a writer on this, and has been very helpful to so many people. And we're going to invite him in to talk to our audience, youth workers, parents, pastors, others who are listening in. And I was, before we switch over to have a conversation with Preston, just some thoughts from you. I was thinking about, as someone who has been navigating the youth ministry world for years, I know you've lived there as well. What are some of the big concerns you have about how we are addressing this? Where we have gaps, let's say, where do we have to do some better thinking? What are some of the bigger questions and areas? From your standpoint, what are those?
Well, I think the biggest, the very first one is we just don't talk about it. I think that it's something that I find many youth ministries will just kind of fly over through a sex series. They really don't want to bring it up. They've seen how divisive it can be. And I think that we need to be able to have some conversations around this, not just one-off series, not just one-off talks, but like overall consistently having good conversations of sex and sexuality and relationship in our youth ministries year in and year out. And then I just think a really good theological approach to all of sexuality, not just LGBT, but a really robust understanding is really important because it will inform and impact the way that we have these conversations in our youth ministries. What about you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was jotting down some things, as I was thinking about this, that I would call these, areas of concern where I think we need to do better and have a more robust understanding or a more robust biblical theology, something that's based on scriptures as opposed to feeling, because we're humans, right? We tend to operate solely at the level of our feelings, what we think is right, what we think is wrong, what we think is best, what we don't, and we really need to get back to Scripture. So, a couple of the things I've thought about, and I really want to ask Preston about some of these. It relates to ecclesiology and what is the role of the church in this, not just in terms of thinking, but pragmatics. How do we nurture people? How do we help people? How do we enable people to flourish in the way God intended us to flourish as sexual beings? And there's a lot of disagreement on that. And so I want to ask him about love. I think we've drained love of its meaning, and love has become, the practice of love is giving the people we say we love permission to do whatever they feel like they want to do, rather than giving people guidance on how God intends them to flourish. So I think that's a big one. And then, how that would work itself out, I think, is in terms of church membership. I think we've got a lot of youth workers who are in churches now. They've grown up in churches where they have no concept of what church membership is. We maybe talk about guests or partners or something like that. And I think membership is important because there's this, I know for me, just this accountability that exists when I take membership seriously, and when I recite membership vows, and I know that I have a group of people who don't want to see me shipwrecked, but rather want to have me anchored to the truth and want me to flourish. So what would play into that as well and is, matters of discipline. And I think the great majority of us now come from churches where that's not even considered. We just want people there, and we don't think about how to, help people. So those are some questions I would want to ask, and some issues as well. I know you mentioned posture, and that really encompasses all. So,
for sure.
So we're
really big
one. So we're going to have this conversation. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back and talk to Preston Sprinkle, and it's going to be a conversation that I think will be really beneficial to parents, to pastors, and especially to youth workers. Stick with us. In an effort to help you help the kids you know and love navigate their emerging sexuality to the glory of God, we've launched a sexual integrity initiative here at CPYU. Thanks to a generous grant from a company called DAS, you can access our sexual integrity initiative and a growing number of resources for free by visiting the website at sexualintegrityinitiative.com.
Welcome back to Youth Culture Matters. We are here with our guest today, with Dr. Preston Sprinkle. And Preston, if you're not already familiar with him, you should be. His work has been influential in the life of our own ministry, Project 619. And his books, People to be Loved, Living in a Gray World, have been phenomenal resources, along with his Grace Truth series that he, with the work that they do through the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, have made available, which we'll talk some about here in the podcast. But I just wanted to say it at the very start that they are great resources. There are things for you to be able to look at and to review and to use in your own youth ministry, or potentially even in your home or in your small group. But they're wonderful resources. But I came to hear Preston years ago on the Q podcast around the gay conversation. It was a great conversation. It was highlighting some of the stuff that he had done in People to be Loved. And so I am just grateful to have Preston here on the podcast here for Youth Culture Matters. So welcome, Preston. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me on, Jason. I'm excited about this.
Well, Walt and I will engage in these issues whenever we get someone who has the ability to speak wisely and compassionately and theologically on these topics around LGBT. And so I would just be curious at the outset, how did you even find yourself engaging in this? Because as I look at what you've done in the past, this wasn't always your area of study. It became an area of study in recent years, but it wasn't always the area of study. So how did it come to be that this was the area that you're focusing a lot of attention on?
Jason, I kind of fell into it. I for some reason, I tend to gravitate towards controversial topics in my writing and speaking, and I didn't plan it that way. I just happened to, address topics that people are debating, and And I kind of like that space of kind of weighing both sides of these debated topics and trying to listen to each side and navigate. Are we hearing each other? And what does the Bible actually say? That's always been my big MO is, sometimes us Christians, we have all these assumptions and we don't have, we can't justify it from the Bible. And if you can't do that, maybe it's not biblical, so that's been my posture in these controversial topics. And so a few years ago, I kind of fell into the question of specifically about homosexuality and same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage. And students were coming to me. I was teaching at a Bible college, and I was getting a lot of questions from students, and college students, they like to rethink things and like to say, have we gotten this right, or why do we believe this? And I was like, well, I don't know. I haven't really looked into it, so let me do some study. And that kind of launched I would say a journey that is still going, really. And I've written a few books on it, and my organization, that's what we do. But it's still, this conversation is always a journey. But early on, I treated it as just a topic or a debate or an issue to solve, and I raced for all the verses that would support my view that I grew up with, that homosexuality is a sin, and I never, I kind of looked around and said, man, I don't know any gay people in my life. And so I started to get to know some LGBT people and listen to their stories and truly listen to where they're coming from and what it's like growing up gay. And I was shocked that many of them had grown up in the church and weren't treated well. They were isolated, alone. Sometimes they were really shamed and mistreated. I mean, I've heard some really horror stories, like, that was a Christian church you grew up in? Like, what the heck, And so I cultivated this massive heart for LGBT people. And then, I'm also studying the theology and seeing what does the Bible say. And I came to the conclusion that, the Bible got it right with this one, that the Bible does say marriage is between a man and a woman, and all sexual relationships belong within that covenant of male-female marriages. And so I'm really, for the last several years, I've been trying to, hold on to both of those truths passionately, that the Bible does say marriage is between a man and woman. The other truth that I'm holding passionately is that we need to preach a gospel that's good news to everybody, and we shouldn't single out certain types of sinners as, you go over there in the corner and deal with this on your own, while we're just going to sit here and sing worship songs and, talk about, our struggle with pride or whatever. It's like, no, we need to lay it all out and make sure that the church is a hospital for all sinners and not most sinners and a graveyard for gay people, which is what has been the experience for a lot of people who grew up in the church. I'm talking millions and millions of LGBT people in America have grown up in the church, and many of those, a high percentage of those, had a really bad experience, not because they had a hard time with the theology in the church, but because they were mistreated and dehumanized and viewed as some like subspecies of the human race. I mean, and that's just not okay. And you can hold to a biblical view of marriage, absolutely, but that should not lead you to dehumanize or mistreat or even neglect people who are struggling with something that maybe the majority isn't struggling with. So that's been my life the last several years, and I don't sleep as well as I used to, but God's taught me a lot through it.
Wow. Because there's really two aspects there, because there's the posture and then there's the theology. And so just sticking with the theology just for a moment, because I think that we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about posture. But I have seen you do this before, and maybe if you could just real quickly dive into why you think marriage, a basis of Scripture and what your own research has found, continues to be the place where it's one man, one woman, the historical definition that we've always given as a church. Because I've seen you do this before, and you've laid out several reasons, and so maybe if you could do that quickly here for some of our listeners that maybe haven't been exposed to that.
Sure. That's a great question, and you hit the nail on the head. The conversation must begin with the definition of marriage. I mean, I found in the homosexuality conversation, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? People race to the 5 or 6 passages that say, don't have gay sex, and I'm like, that's actually, you're entering into the middle of the conversation by doing it. That's not where the discussion should begin. It needs to begin with, what is marriage? And biblically, and if we had time, if you want to get into it, I can show this. It's not unclear. It's not obtuse. I mean, the Bible says very clearly, and Christianity has always taught, that marriage is by definition the joining together of two sexually different persons. It's not, as most people, I would say most Christians would say, oh yeah, marriage, two people fall in love and, they're not hurting anybody. They're committed to each other. And what does it matter what two people do in the bedroom anyway? And then they kind of have, oh yeah, and the church teaches that it should be between a man and a woman also. And then they start questioning, well, why? And that's where we get off the rails. The question isn't two people the same sex, can two people the same sex get married? That's not the question. The question is, what is marriage? Marriage, by definition, is the joining together of two sexually different persons. We see this at the end of Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and Matthew 19. Jesus refers to it. The church has consistently taught this globally for 2,000 years. Not just the church. I mean, monotheism. Let's just throw in Islam. Let's throw in LDS. Let's throw in Judaism. I mean, this is just been part of the monotheistic tradition that marriage is the joining together of sexually different persons. It's not the joining together of two adults, and oh, by the way, we happen to prefer it to be between a man and a woman. You see the difference there? It's a really crucial difference. So, and it's funny because a lot of people are shifting their view on this. They're opening up marriage to include same-sex couples, and it's just whenever I push people and say, what is your definition of marriage, and where did you get that definition from, and how does Scripture inform that definition? It's fascinating how even really smart people who are changing their view of marriage say, well, it's just, two people are falling in love. I'm like, well, but where did you get that definition from? Because that's not a biblical definition of marriage. So, so there's several passages in the Bible that say, a man shall not sleep with a man as he does with a woman. And those are important, but those are actually secondary or thirdary or whatever. Like those are down the road. We need to begin with what is marriage, and go from there.
Do you, as I've read all kinds of, books on the different positions that people are trying to work and think biblically and theologically on this. Is it accurate to say? I mean, my impression has been that we have to, as you say, obviously start with Genesis, go back to Genesis, see God's order and design, what God made and declared as good. Do you find that sometimes some of those who, in my opinion, are doing exegetical gymnastics, hermeneutical gymnastics, are actually not going back to Genesis? Or
well, I always say there's two different types of, let's just say, people who are who affirm
right.
Same-sex marriage, same-sex relationships. The majority would be people that they just want to love everybody. They don't have a lot of theological roots. Maybe their son is gay, their neighbors, their best friend's gay, and they're tired of hearing these horror stories of how they've been treated by the church. And so they, in many ways, in a very noble way, they like, man, I just want to love people. I'm tired of excluding them. That would be one type. And yeah, they may not be able to go to Genesis and have any sort of response to anything I said. There is another group, and it's larger than people think, but this is more of the thoughtful, affirming people who have done research, who have looked at scholarly studies, because there are counter arguments to everything I've said, and some of them are thoughtful. I don't think they're good or accurate, but they can be very compelling. Like some people say, well, no, Genesis, it's all about it's getting the story started. And yes, the original vision of marriage was male female. Why? Because all marriages were really just for procreation. And so they would push it back on me, say, do you think that marriage is only for procreation? I say, well, no, I think there's other aspects. And they would say, well, the Genesis story is just about procreation. It's how to populate the earth. But we've now moved beyond that. And now the earth's populated. We have plenty of people on earth. And now marriage is more than just for procreation. And so now we can open up the definition to include same-sex couples. Now, for several reasons, I think it's wrong and not a good argument, but it can be a compelling one, and it does show that people have thought through the Genesis and developed some sort of response to it. The problem is it's not just in Genesis. Jesus affirms it in the New Testament, and he, in Matthew 19, verses 4-6, he goes back and he draws on Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 to define marriage. So at least I got Jesus on my side, which is kind of a big one. And all throughout church history, we don't see the definition of marriage being rearranged, even though the earth's populated and so on. So, yeah, I would want to divide people who hold to an affirming view in kind of two broad camps. The sort of soft affirming, I just want to love people, I don't really know their arguments, and then other people that have done a bit of research. And there's a large body of literature out there that argues from scripture, from real in-depth research for affirming same-sex marriage. And you get into conversations with some of these people, or people have done a lot of reading, and they're not stupid. They're not just, oh, I've never thought through Genesis. And this is why I think I encourage all Christians to dig deep and figure out, why do you believe what you believe? Don't just assume, oh, I know what my view is, because you can get in a conversation with a 23-year-old kid who's done a lot of reading, and he's going to throw arguments at you that you're like, wow, I never thought of it like that, So
yeah. Hey, can I follow up with another question there real quick, because you alluded to this, and I think in my opinion, I think it's important. But you talked about people who just want to love everybody, and I think a lot about that word love and how it's been drained of its meaning. I grew up not really understanding what that was. I think it takes being married to really start to understand that a little bit, and reboot your misunderstandings and turn them into understandings, as you think about commitment. But when you said people who just want to love everybody and stop the process of exclusion, I think sometimes we equate love with inclusion, a borderless, boundaryless inclusion, and we would say that maybe a good definition, working definition of exclusion would be hate, which we would think of in our vernacular as the opposite. This plays in a lot to posture. And as someone who studied theology, say something about love. Are we understanding it correctly biblically, or are we misunderstanding it? And how do we need to, if we misunderstand it, reboot our understanding of love? Because that will figure into how we do just about anything in life with other people.
There's a massive disconnect between the modern understanding of love and the biblical understanding of love. Biblical love, agape love, is always the way I frame it is loving. Love is the direction of love is toward holiness. And I think there's this false dichotomy in the modern meaning of love of, love means you let people do what they want. Love means if somebody wants to live this way, that way, you don't say anything. If you say something, then you're being judgmental. You're not being loving. And those dichotomies just don't exist in Scripture. I mean, one of my favorite lines is Jesus in John 15. He tells his disciples, love one another as I have loved you. And any basic reading of the Gospels, you can see that Jesus was, did he just never say a word to his disciples? No, he was on them all the time. Like, come on, you guys, get it together. And, you want to rain down fire on this city and exclude that person, or, do something stupid over here. Like, no, Jesus's view of love was toward holiness, and it involved, saying something about how people are living and so on. So, yeah, the direction of love is toward holiness. And the thing is most modern people, if you really break it down, they're going to agree with that. They just have different, there's certain pet kind of doctrines that they want to, maintain, and other ones they don't want to maintain. But if somebody is like a racist, most people that say, oh, love is love and just love anybody. Well, okay, my brother-in-law is a raging racist, and he's telling racial jokes. So does love mean you don't say anything about that? You just like, oh, hey, if that works for you, go for it. Well, no, like everybody has some moral impulse and standard. I just want to say, let's just be consistent and have a biblical moral standard across the board. And yes, confront racism and confront somebody who's living in ongoing, unrepentant sexual sin. So, but yeah, the definition of love, I think, is a big sticking point. I think the way it's used today, inside and outside the church, is we need to get back to what the Bible says about love.
Preston, this is really good stuff. We're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, I want to continue this conversation, specifically transitioning to conversation around posture. I think that's going to be an important one. We're moving the conversation there, so I want to continue moving in that direction, so we'll do that right after this break.
Here at CPYU, we want to help you help parents stay up to date on today's youth culture. One of our most popular resources is our monthly parent page. This 4-page full-color resource offers parents a timely, practical look into current youth culture trends, along with resources to help them parent their children and teens Christianly in today's rapidly changing youth culture. If you're a youth worker who would like to get this monthly resource into the hands of your parents, you can see a sample parent page and learn more by visiting cpyuparentpage.com. Well, welcome back to Youth Culture Matters. Walt Mueller and Jason Sochanek here, and we're having a great conversation with Preston Sprinkle. We're going to include at the end lots and lots of links so you can learn more about what Preston's doing in terms of some of the writing and the resources from the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, along with their podcast, which we may talk about here later. We will include a link to that. But we're talking about Preston's story and how he came to some of the conclusions that he's come to, and the posture we need to have in the LGBTQ conversation. So, Jason, you were going to follow up with something you wanted to ask right after the break.
Yeah, I think that what would be really good is maybe laying out some stats around LGBT, things that we know about LGBT experience in the church and what that might lead us to understand with posture. And I know that you've done this quite a bit. You've studied it extensively. So maybe if you could just dive into some of the statistics that you've found in the midst of your own research.
Yeah, early on when I was just getting to know LGBT people and hearing the stories, I was kind of shocked at how many had a church background experience, and, growing up in a conservative evangelical church, it was always kind of like Christians and then the gay community, as in two kind of completely different things. And I found out that a lot of people in the gay community were at one point in the church. And then just a few years ago, a massive study came out that was done by a guy named Andrew Marin, who's done some great work creating bridges between the church and the LGBT community. And he surveyed almost 2,000 LGBT people around the country to figure out what is their religious background. What is the religious background of LGBT people? And he discovered that 83% of the LGBT people grew up in the church. And that's a huge percentage. Like, I think the national average is like 70%, like the average American, 70% have kind of some church background. So the LGBT community is, 83%. But we also found out from that study that 51% have left after they're 18, like they're fleeing from the church. And that's not shocking. And most people are going to say, well, of course, if you're gay, the church teaches that you can't, you shouldn't, two people of the same sex can't get married, then that's must be why they're leaving the church, because of our theology of marriage. But according to that survey, according to the testimony of LGBT people themselves, only 3% said they left the church primarily for theological reasons, meaning 97%, we're talking several million LGBT people, left the church primarily for relational reasons, like they were scared at church, they were alone, isolated, or they just couldn't handle the hypocrisy, like they weren't allowed to struggle with their sin while everybody else is struggling with their sin, or in some cases they were just kicked out once they said, hey, I'm struggling with my sexuality, can I get some help? And I know several horror stories of people being ushered out of church after just saying, I'm struggling, or maybe not so blatantly ushered out, but implicitly are ushered out. Like once it's known that they have a unique struggle, then the whole church kind of pulls back and looks at them from a distance, and real heart-wrenching stuff. So this is where some of my friends who are changing their theology because they just want to love everybody and they want to love LGBT people, and the only way they think they can do that is by redefining marriage to include same-sex couples. But I think that approach is really a misdiagnosis of the problem. I've got testimony after testimony after testimony where LGBT people in the church, they said, it wasn't really the theology, it was just a horrible posture, and that's why I left. So changing your theology to love well is not, especially if you're changing your theology to hold to a view that God doesn't say. That's that comes with its own problems. But even still, even if you just go on the motivation of I just want to love people, that's not the right way to love people. So this is where I do think that it's time for the church to do both well, to hold strong to the truth and also love people who fall short of that truth and who have unique struggles. And I think we absolutely can do that and do it much better than we have been doing it.
So then the question is, what would be some of those steps that you would say need to be included if you're in leadership in the church? Specifically, many of our listeners are youth workers. What might you say to them? How do we truly love? Because based upon what we've talked about, it sounds like we're able to hold true to the traditional biblical sexual ethic and truly love. So what might be some things that you would say in the midst of that regarding posture, regarding response?
Good question. And almost, I would say more than, say, 90% of LGBT people, when they first recognize, usually it's around, 10, 12, 13 years old, puberty. So sometimes it's even earlier when they notice, like when I was a 6-year-old, I was looking at guys in a way that I found out later that, it's because I'm gay or whatever. But whenever they're wrestling, if they start to experience their attraction to the same sex, almost in more than 90% of the cases, it's initially unwanted. Like they don't want these attractions. They're battling. They're doing it privately, and they're scared to talk to anybody. And then sometimes they hold that privately till it gets so bad that it's like, I just got to leave the church because I know if I can talk about it out there, I just can't talk about it inside the church. So the number one thing we need to do is create a culture and environment where people, especially early on, can wrestle out loud. And that how do you create that culture? Well, it begins by just talking about it, and talking about it in a way that's not like, okay, we're going to do this series on homosexuality, this special little thing, but just making, look, I know for a fact, every kid, every youth person is struggling with their sexuality, whether it's opposite sex porn addiction or women, trying to match up to the, guys that aren't giving girls attention anymore because they're just addicted to porn, and now girls are trying to get more attention. It's a mess. It's a train wreck. So, in that train wreck, in addressing just a mess of sexuality, just include everybody there. Hey, you're struggling with porn. Hey, you're struggling with masturbation. Hey, you're struggling with same-sex attraction, and we want to create an environment where we can talk about these things. You can come to me, and maybe you believe you've been born in the wrong body, or maybe you're, you just can't stop watching porn. Like, just almost every gay person I know says, just include me in the struggle. Just make me a normal sinner, not like some special, like, spotlight case that we treat separately. Just include me in everybody else. Everybody else is broken. We all know it these days. It's no secret. Just include me in that brokenness, so it's not some scarlet letter struggle. Because the number one thing we want is when people are struggling, and initially it is a struggle. Sometimes they become okay with it, and hey, I'm not struggling, I'm just gay, and that's who I am. But initially it is almost always a struggle. So in that time period, 12 to 14 years old, create a culture where they can wrestle out loud and not feel threatened or not feel like they'll be judged. I say, I get in trouble for this, but if you have ears to hear what I'm saying, I think it'll make sense. Like, I long for the day when someone could publicly say, hey, I'm struggling with my same-sex attraction, and everybody will yawn. Not that we diminish sin or whatever, but it's like, oh, take a number. I'm struggling with this, this, and this. And hey, can we join arms and wrestle together as one broken sinner helping another broken sinner follow Jesus? Like, I long for the day when that could be the culture. If people can wrestle out loud early on, I think we would have less people fleeing the church to find love, and that's what we need to create.
So in the church, then, as I'm thinking about youth workers right now, I spend a lot of time with youth workers, and I find that they're struggling to answer these questions, which is why I loved the question Jason asked and the answer you just gave. But how do we go beyond that now? Because many youth workers have no experience of or concept of ecclesiology that would have within it, church membership, let's say, and even beyond that, discipline. I think discipline is, by and large, by many in the church today, scorned, seen as a negative thing, probably because of the way it's been carried out or misunderstandings of what we're called to do there. But how would membership and discipline play into this, as you said, with this large mess? I love how I'm thinking about the train wreck of all the sexual brokenness and sin that's there. How do they play into this? Do you have any recommendations or advice on that?
so much of this conversation does overlap tremendously with both ecclesiology and soteriology, our understanding of salvation and the impossibility of getting saved. I think we have fallen into this idea we're trying to shoehorn everybody into the kingdom, and we don't want to do anything. You preach too much truth or whatever, and people are going to be scared away. We need to kind of ease them in. And I'm not a big fan of, hellfire, brimstone, or whatever. Like, I'm not that at all. But man, I mean, Jesus was pretty upfront with the truth, and it is a high calling, and it's not for everybody. The road is narrow, and it's impossible, and to die to yourself is not easy. And hey, come join me in a life of suffering. Like, yeah, that's not a fun message to preach, and you'll probably shrink your youth group a bit, but the positive is you'll probably get a higher percentage of genuine followers who are saying, no, I do want to give it all for Christ. But I guess my question to answer before I can even answer the question, it seems that most youth ministries are not, they're more, if I can say, evangelistic or attractional. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's hard to answer ecclesiological questions when youth ministry is kind of like, it's not technically like a church. It's not focused as much on discipleship. It's focused more on, get tons of unbelievers, believers, whatever. Let's just get here and preach the gospel and get people saved. And most youth ministries that I'm familiar with put much more of an emphasis on getting people there and keeping people there so that they can hear about Jesus. But as far as rigorous, like, cross-bearing discipleship, that doesn't seem to be the emphasis in youth ministry. So I guess that would be my first question is, are you trying to be evangelistic and attractional? I think both youth pastors say, yeah, totally. I'm just trying to get kids saved. And then I guess that's okay. Then we couldn't really have real robust ecclesiological questions there. I would almost want to hope, but I'm not, you guys are the experts on youth ministry, so I'm speaking out of turn here a little bit, but I would almost hope it would maybe be a bit of a both and. Mm-hmm. And I would almost gravitate more towards the rigorous discipleship, because if all we do is attract people to a youth group and keep them there, and maybe there's good teaching or whatever, but once they turn 18 to go off to college, they're getting thrown to the wolves. They're still addicted to porn. They have a messed up view of sexuality, relationships. They don't, even with all the technology today, like they don't even know how to have good same-sex, non-sexual relationships. Everybody's head downs on their phone. They're not sure how to relate to each other. They break up with their girlfriends through text, and I think we're becoming relationally stupid. And then we're throwing them out to go to university where they're going to have, a professor who is going to, very casually say, you really believe that Bible thing? Like, come on. And it's going to be able to dismantle that. So I think we're doing kids a disservice if we just are attracting them and keeping them in maybe a high energy environment and then throwing them out to the world as 18-year-olds without preparing them. So whatever approach you take, evangelistic, whatever, I think there has to be some serious, in-depth, challenging discipleship built into that. And then I guess I would go more to your question, Walt, that if somebody says, no, I'm a Jesus follower, I want to follow him, I want to pick up my cross, and then they're not actually living that way, I think that's when we need to take the approach of, in love and tears and warning, like, hey man, if you don't come and worship Jesus all energetically and then not have any desire to follow him, or when you're, called on your unrepentant sin, you're not listening, or you don't care, or you're shrugging it off. Like, that's not what it is to follow. Like, we're doing people a disservice if we make them think you can be an actual Jesus follower and not follow Jesus. Like, that we're doing them a disservice. Yeah. And we're contributing to this statistic that 80% of kids who are involved in the youth group end up leaving the church after 10 years. If they don't learn the hard road to discipleship as teenagers, they're not going to get it when they're young adults.
Hey, I'm just going to say this, and back to you, Jason, but just in response to your answer there, without having much experience in or saying, hey, I really don't know the youth ministry world, I think in many ways you nailed it there. Duffy Robbins and I, when we did I'll just share this with you, the Symposium on Biblical Sexuality and a Changing Youth Culture up at Gordon Conwell back in January, we did some case studies, and they were real-life case studies. We brought people in, from camps and youth ministries that have had to deal with some of the tough, practical, pragmatic questions about, what do we do about housing on a retreat? What do we do at our camp if this situation comes up? And they've dealt with these things. And when we've asked them how they've responded, there's been no plan or forethought or thinking beyond, I just want to get them to Jesus. That's what we heard so many times. But then, we didn't really hear, like, what does that mean to get them to Jesus, and what do we do with them afterwards? So like you said, the theology of difficulty, the cost of discipleship, as Bonhoeffer wrote, or, I'm inviting you into a life of suffering, as Jesus says, what do we think it means to take up your cross? This is good. And again, I'm saying this because this is where youth workers really have to think. So thanks for challenging us on that. That was good.
Yeah. Preston, thank you. This has been really thought-provoking, and hopefully those that are listening are able to utilize some of the many resources that are available through the website centerforfaith.com. So if you're listening, make sure you check it out. I do want to highlight very quickly one, and then maybe if you can add some other resources, but the Grace Truth series that you have available at the centerforfaith.com. Can you just describe what that is? Because I think there might be some listeners that could utilize and benefit from that. And then maybe one or two other resources beyond your own books that you might recommend for those that are listening.
Yeah, I would love to. The Grace Truth series is really a almost like the climax of several years of my journey in this. I call it the Grace Truth learning experience. I don't even like small group study because personally I think a lot of people are just kind of bored of small group studies, and what we want to do is get a combination of video resources, of testimonies, of teaching, of questions, of podcasts, other papers we can go deeper. So it's a whole learning experience that's designed for a 5-week, it is supposed to be a small group study, and it's called Grace Truth, 5 conversations every thoughtful Christian should have about faith, sexuality, and gender. Kind of a long subtitle, but it's trying, everything we've been talking about, it's trying to get people into the conversation. And we found that most people are like, well, I don't know how to manage that conversation. I'm like, okay, let us lead it for you. We'll provide everything for you. You can kind of facilitate and learn along. So it's designed for people that haven't spent hundreds of hours in this conversation, but they can still facilitate a good conversation. So yeah, Grace Truth, it's only available. It's not on Amazon. Actually, I think the ebook is, but you got to go to centerforfaith.com and get it there. And so it's a combination of videos and small group reading material and so on. As far as other resources, there's not a lot out there. In fact, one of the reasons why I wrote my book, Living in a Gray World, it's called A Christian Teen's Guide for Homosexuality, is because they're literally, as far as I know, there's not a single book that's written directly to teens from a traditional or historically Christian perspective on marriage and sexuality. There's a lot of stuff out there that says just be you, do whatever you want. But as far as, hey, no, let's still maintain what the Bible says, but let's navigate these turbulent waters well and in love and in grace. So that's Living in a Gray World. If you're a youth leader,
it's great.
Mark Yarhouse has a book directed to youth leaders. So my book's directed towards actual youth. His book is helping youth leaders wrestle with this conversation. I forget the name of that, but if you just Google Mark Yarhouse,
I'm forgetting it too, but we'll include the link.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's a great resource too. So those right there would probably keep you busy enough for a while.
Let me throw something else in, Jason, from the centerforfaith.com, and this is a resource that I found to be really helpful. Youth workers go there. There's you can view pastoral papers there. So on questions like, is it okay to attend a same-sex wedding? Is same-sex attraction or being gay a sin? Should I baptize children adopted by same-sex couples? How should I respond to my child if they tell me they are LGBT plus? Is having hormone therapy or sex reassignment surgery biblically acceptable? So there's pastoral papers on there, and I think that's actually growing. There's more titles on there than those. So yeah, well worth your time.
Yeah, and those are all free. Those are
right
now they are. Down the road, we may make them kind of subscription based only, but right now they're all free. So download them while you can.
That's great. Hey, Preston, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for just sharing some of your knowledge and expertise on this. And I'm positive we'll have you back on because we only touch the surface of what is a very rich and needed conversation. So, Preston, thanks for your time, and for those listening, we appreciate you being with us here on this episode of Youth Culture Matters. We look forward to being with you on the next episode.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.